If you grew up in a freezing works town in New Zealand, AFFCO wasn't just a company. It was the reason your dad left before sunrise, the reason your mum knew exactly when payday was, the reason the butcher, the pub, the dairy, and the rugby club all stayed open. For more than a century, AFFCO plants weren't just workplaces. They were the heartbeat of entire communities. And for a long time, no one questioned that heartbeat. It was just there, solid, reliable, permanent. Until one day, people started to notice it wasn't beating quite the same. AFFCO's story begins in the early 1900s, when New Zealand was building itself into a global meat exporter. Refrigeration changed everything. Suddenly, sheep and cattle raised in Waikato or Hawke's Bay could be eaten on the other side of the world. Freezing works sprang up across the country, and AFFCO plants grew with them, plant by plant, town by town. Horotiu, Rangiuru, Wairoa, Moerewa. These weren't just dots on a map, they were livelihoods. Generations of the same families worked the chain, year after year, season after season. It was brutal work, cold, dangerous, repetitive. But it was honest, and it paid. For decades, AFFCO was deeply tied to farmers and local supply. It wasn't perfect, but it felt grounded. Decisions were close to the land, close to the people doing the work. But the global food system doesn't stand still, and by the late 1990s and early 2000s, the pressure was building. Overseas buyers wanted cheaper meat. Supermarkets wanted consistency. Costs were rising, margins were shrinking. And slowly, quietly, the old model started to crack. Then came the global financial crisis. By the late 2000s, AFFCO was under serious financial pressure. Years of expansion had left it carrying heavy debt, and when global markets tightened, that weight became impossible to ignore. The company wasn't collapsing, not publicly anyway, but it was vulnerable. And in business, vulnerability doesn't stay private for long. This is the moment when ownership matters. This is the moment when control shifts. In 2010, Talleys moved in. Talleys Group wasn't new to this game. They were already a heavyweight. Fishing, dairy, food processing, vertically integrated and privately controlled. When Talleys acquired full control of AFFCO by October 2010, it was presented as a rescue, a stabilisation, a New Zealand company saving another New Zealand company. And technically, that's true. AFFCO survived. Plants stayed open, exports continued, but something fundamental changed that year, and most people didn't see it happening, because ownership doesn't just decide who signs the checks, ownership decides what matters. Within 2 years, the consequences started surfacing, not in boardrooms, but on the factory floor. In early 2012, AFFCO locked out roughly 700 to 750 workers across several North Island plants, Horotiu, Rangiuru, and others. The dispute centred on employment agreements, productivity, and cost controls. AFFCO said it needed flexibility to survive in a fiercely competitive global market. Workers and unions said the changes would gut job security in an industry that was already seasonal and physically punishing. What followed wasn't a quick disagreement, it was a full-scale rupture. For around 12 weeks, roughly 84 days by some accounts, workers were locked out or on strike. No pay, no certainty. Families burned through savings. Communities held fundraisers just to keep food on tables. And while the dispute officially ended in May 2012 after mediation, the damage didn't end there. Because while workers were standing outside the gates, livestock was being diverted elsewhere. Processing contracts were rewritten, supply chains adjusted, and once that happens, it's very hard to rewind. This is one of the least understood parts of the story. In meat processing, confidence is everything. When plants stop, even temporarily, farmers don't wait. They move. And when they move, the work doesn't always come back. Although the 2012 dispute ended on paper, trust didn't magically return. Further industrial disputes would flare up in later years, including lockouts and strikes around 2015, reinforcing the sense that the relationship between workers and management had fundamentally shifted. AFFCO was still operating, but the old certainty was gone. The feeling that this was a job you could build a life around began to fade. Then came the quiet phase, the part that rarely makes headlines. Across the 2000s and 10s, AFFCO began rationalising. Processing lines were reduced, seasonal closures stretched longer, staffing levels fluctuated year to year. No single announcement, no dramatic shutdown, just a slow tightening. For towns built around freezing works, even small reductions mattered. Fewer shifts meant fewer wages. Fewer wages meant fewer customers, and fewer customers meant businesses quietly shutting their doors. Places like Wairoa felt it immediately. When the AFFCO plant there slowed, the impact rippled outward. Schools, rentals, shops. Horotiu, once one of the country's biggest beef plants, saw its role change too. The work was still there, but it felt less anchored, less permanent, less promised. And then there's Moerewa. Contrary to what some people believe, AFFCO did not shut the Moerewa plant in 2018. It continues to operate today as a multi-species processing site and remains a major regional employer. But 2018 was still a turning point. For a different reason. A catastrophic boiler explosion left a worker with burns to around 75% of his body. WorkSafe later found serious safety failures and fined the company. For the community, this wasn't just an accident. It was a moment that cut through the corporate language and landed in a very human way. Because efficiency targets and cost controls don't bleed. People do. By this point, AFFCO had fully transitioned into something else. It was no longer just a meat processor. It was part of a vertically integrated agribusiness machine. Decisions about staffing, investment, and plant viability were no longer primarily local. They were strategic, centralised, calculated. From a business perspective, this made sense. From a worker's perspective, it meant fewer levers to pull when things went wrong. Then COVID arrived.
China has identified the cause of the mysterious new virus.
Coronavirus.
Meat plants were deemed essential, but outbreaks, border closures, and labour shortages exposed just how fragile the system had become. Shifts were disrupted, throughput slowed, pressure intensified. And while AFFCO continued operating, the pandemic accelerated trends that were already in motion. Fewer workers doing more work, less tolerance for disruption, and an even stronger focus on efficiency over resilience. So here's the uncomfortable truth. AFFCO didn't collapse. It didn't disappear. And it wasn't destroyed in a single dramatic moment. It was transformed. So when people ask, what happened to AFFCO? The answer isn't simple. It didn't die. It didn't fail. It evolved into something colder, something leaner, something that still functions, but no longer belongs to the people who built it. And if you lived through a strike, a shutdown, a redundancy, or watched your town shrink after a plant closed, you don't need a documentary to explain it. The real question isn't what happened to AFFCO. It's whether this is what happens to every New Zealand company once scale, debt, and overseas pressure take over, and whether we ever notice until the lights go out. Let us know in the comments if AFFCO affected your town, your family, or your livelihood. And if you want more deep dives into the brands and institutions that quietly shaped and reshaped New Zealand, make sure you're subscribed.